Hey everybody, let's talk about pacing mechanics. This is something that doesn't get discussed enough, even though it's critical, and most games use them. So let's talk about them. A pacing mechanic is a mechanic intended to give the player traction and flow, as opposed to a mechanic that's designed to be fun. Yep, pacing mechanics are the boring mechanics. Why would you ever want a boring mechanic? Well, let's talk about it. In Animal Crossing, you can harvest from trees, but you can only harvest once per real-world day. This is a pacing mechanic. It gives the player traction by pulling them into the game every day and making them do a simple task. But it then lets them go. You can't keep harvesting the trees. Once you've harvested the trees and got what you came for, you then move on to other things. So it pulls you into the game, it puts you in the right mindset to play the game, and then it lets you play the game. That's a pacing mechanic. You can think of it as catch and release. You can think of it as traction and flow. Another physical example would be Pokemon Go, which pushes you to go out into the real world and throw your Pokeballs at monsters. That's another pacing mechanic. It pushes you to go out into the real world so that you can feel like a 12-year-old in a forest rather than a 40-year-old trying to pretend that they're in a forest while they're on a commute. By putting you in the right mindset to play the game, it makes you more likely to play the game. So you go outside and then you can play. That's the basic idea of Pokemon Go. Not all mechanics that involve the real world are pacing mechanics, though. For example, there is a new tendency for every single mobile game to have an energy meter that goes away as you play, and then when you run out, you're supposed to go to the cash shop and buy more energy. That's not a pacing mechanic, or more accurately, it's a really crappy one. The reason is obvious. That's a cash shop mechanic, not a pacing mechanic. But why isn't it a pacing mechanic? Well, it doesn't catch and release. It doesn't give you traction and flow. Pacing mechanics are supposed to put you in the right mindset and then let you play. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, this energy meter thing lets you play the game for a long time without interrupting you and then stops you. It's almost the exact opposite of a pacing mechanic. It just so happens that it lets up the next day and you can come back and get more energy, with the natural recharge. So it can feel a little bit like a pacing mechanic just by accident. But the point is that that is not a pacing mechanic. And there are a lot of mechanics that can be mistaken for pacing mechanics. But when you stop and think about how they actually pace the player, you realize that they're full of holes and they don't work. And that's because they're probably there for some other reason. And we'll talk about some other examples of that. But let's talk about more common examples of pacing mechanics, because using real-world time and real-world space is pretty rare. The current king of pacing mechanics is undoubtedly Stardew Valley, which one of the pacing mechanics it has is it asks you to water your plants every morning. In-game morning. So you can play as long as you want, but every in-game morning you water your plants. And what that does is it pulls you into the game world by making you do this very simple ritual of watering your plants, and then it lets you play the rest of the day. So it puts you in the mood to play the game, and then it lets you play the game. And every single time you save and quit, you're going to be waking up when you start up again. That's how it works. So you're never going to go into the game in the middle of the day. You're always going to go into the game and wake up. And then what are you going to do? You're going to water your plants. You're never going to go into Stardew Valley and think, oh no, what did I have to do? I can't remember anything. You got to know what you have to do. You have to water your plants. And while you're doing that, you'll probably remember a whole lot more about the game, and you'll definitely be in the mood to play it. And you can't really do anything wrong aside from not watering your plants. So, there you go. It's the perfect pacing mechanic to pull you back into the game, and it keeps you straight and true. You're in the right mindset to play the game every single morning. So that's like every 10 or 15 minutes of the game, you're recentered and your calibration is reset, and you go back to playing the game. So That's not the only pacing mechanic Stardew Valley has. It's actually got about half a dozen really tightly interlocked pacing mechanics. It's well worth studying. I'm not sure if he did it on purpose or on accident, but it's fairly brilliant pacing mechanics-wise. So you can go ahead and study that if you really want to talk about pacing mechanics. I've also got a write-up on my blog if you care. But that's not the only kind of in-world, like game world pacing mechanic that you can have. Another very simple one is in an RPG, where you're running around the dungeons and you're fighting monsters. And the monsters are dying, but you are running low on MP. So what do? You go back to the town, and you stay at an inn, and your MP is restored. In the process, you're put in the right mindset to play the town part of the game, to buy new gear, to level up, to get new quests from talkative NPCs, to buy land or trade goods or whatever. So you have all of these options in town, and the fact that there is a pulse to the gameplay where you can't simply stay in one mode forever means that there is a pacing mechanic that will pull you back and forth between those various modes. Now, the player is always in control with this kind of pacing mechanic. They're not forced to go back to town, except for in very specific circumstances. They are simply allowed to run out of mana, and they realize that they had better go do something about that before they die. And it's a very natural feel where the player will instinctively begin to follow this pace back and forth between gameplay modes, and it will feel very natural. They'll never really feel like they're being dictated to. That's very powerful. Skyrim is the reigning king of that, and I think I made a whole video about that, but basically, while you're wandering through the forest in Skyrim, you will see a town. Maybe you're not in the mood for a town, maybe you will continue to be in the forest, but at some point, you will get tired of being in the forest because you will run out of stuff to do, and then you'll go to a town, and eventually you'll run out of stuff to do in the town, you'll go back to the forest. So that kind of mode switching requires a pacing mechanic to help you switch modes. And that is that situation. That is the difference, the statistical difference between being in a town and being in the wild. In an old RPG, you'd have to restore your mana or something like that. In a new one, it might just be that you run out of things to do out in the wild. But either way, switching modes requires a pacing mechanic to help the player center themselves in the new mode. They have to be in the right mindset for the new mode. And that's where the pacing mechanic comes into play. And it's something very basic, like staying at an inn. It's never a challenge. It's never fun. It's just something you do to put yourself in the right mindset. Now, an example that is not a pacing mechanic, even though it looks like it might be, is in Minecraft or a similar game when you suddenly get hungry. Now I want to eat something, like a fried egg. How can I go and eat a fried egg? I better go ahead and start to farm something, or I better go hunt some meat or something. Is that a pacing mechanic? Well, no, not really. It's a tutorial mechanic because there's no action for you to take. Eating does not put you in the right mindset to keep eating or to play an eating mode game. It's simply a task which makes you want to automate that kind of task. So it pulls you into performing the construction part of the game, to building a farm, raising animals, that sort of stuff. It's a tutorial mechanic. It's the exact same as if you start with $1,000 in SimCity, and when you run out of money, it's expected that your city will be profitable. It's a tutorial mechanic. You give the player so much freedom, and then when they hit the end of the freedom, they had better have figured out how to keep playing. And that's just not the same kind of mechanic. It's not a bad mechanic necessarily, but it's certainly not a mechanic that helps the pacing. But Minecraft does have a lot of pacing mechanics, and probably the most normal one, the one that's easiest to talk about, is the materials, the biome restrictions. In Minecraft, you can only do so much in any given biome. And I'm not just talking about having a wooden or stone axe versus a steel axe. I'm talking about basics like if you're building yourself a huge mansion out of wood, you can only do so much with wood. And at some point, you're going to be like, okay, well, I had better go get some steel, or I had better go get some redstone. Maybe I'll go get some glass, get myself some sand and make some glass, and so on and so forth. I'll put some lava forge in or something like that. There's only so much you can do with the resources at hand. That doesn't mean the resources are running out. It just means that you can't really think of anything new or interesting to do with those resources. So you move into a new biome. And this is the same sort of pacing mechanic where you're switching between two modes of play. You're switching between construction and adventure, or crafting and adventure. And the pacing mechanic helps you to do that by having it so that when you run out, when you're starting to get a little bit bored, you don't realize that you're bored yet, but you're like, what do I build next in my mansion? What's the next step? I know, I should go look for glass. Then the pacing mechanic steps in. And can you tell what the pacing mechanic is here? The pacing mechanic is the switch to adventure mode, where it pulls you out of your home and you're now wandering. So you've prepped, you've picked up food, you've put on your armor. That stuff isn't fun. It's not compelling. It's just that it's what you have to do in order to set out. And that is how you get put in the right mindset to be in adventure mode. So these are pacing mechanics. They're the things that help you switch modes, whether you're switching mode from being not playing the game to playing the game, or whether you're switching modes within the game. It's all about how to make the player have the right mindset so that they can play this part of the game, and then letting them play this part of the game. Now, this is already running pretty long, so I think I'll stop here, but I do want to briefly mention that aside from the best pacing mechanics, which are in Stardew Valley, I think the worst implemented pacing mechanics are in No Man's Sky, which isn't slighting No Man's Sky. I think it's quite a fun game, and I've played it for quite a while, but the pacing mechanics never come together in that game because they're not catch and release. They're not traction and flow. And if you want to know more about that, I'll link to the essay I wrote. But just in general, you can probably figure it out just by thinking about it some. So when you're designing pacing mechanics to help the player get in the right mindset, keep in mind that that's what you're there for. You're there to put them in the right mindset and then let them play. You're not there to raise barriers. You're not there to distract them. You're not there to whip them. You're just there to put them in the right mindset to play the next part of your game.